Welcome back. Thanks again for joining us for another episode as we continue in our study through the book of Genesis. If you're following along with us in Scripture, we are in Genesis chapter number 14 today, and we're going to pick up kind of walking through a bit, another step of the bit of Lot, and really Lot and Abram in this scenario. We've talked about the fact that Lot made a decision to go into Sodom and Gomorrah, and how really his first decision to not really spend time putting God first, looking to see what God would have him to do, put him in a really bad scenario and resulted in a long list of bad decisions that were put on top of it. This is one of those first ones, and we actually see a bit of how God uses Abram to help him out. So we're going to jump into chapter 14. The first few sections is just a bit of history, so we're going to look through that real quick, and I'll explain a little bit why I find these sections to be important. Genesis chapter 14, verse 1, it says, "And it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elasar, Chedorlaomer, I think I said that right, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of the nations, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemabar, king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these joined together in the valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer. In the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Kenarim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shavah Kiriathaim, and the Horatites in the mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hazin Tamar. And the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined together in battle in the valley of Siddim against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of the nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Elasar. 4 kings against 5. Now the valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. Then they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all the provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Now, one of the things that happens when you read sections of Scripture like this, for valid reason, is you begin, sometimes, I've even said this, what is the necessity for 12 verses of details, and sometimes over detail? These kings take on these kings, go to battle. I mean, from a practical perspective, you could have just said there was war and Lot was taken in the war. And a lot of times when we come to this passage, that is kind of how we approach it. We approach it with, all right, hey, by the way, the first few verses, these people went to war. Doesn't matter who they are. Let's go into the principle. And when we look to the ultimate principle, what can we learn? What can we see that Lot's decisions affected him and how God blessed and worked through Abram? When we look at that in a moment, that is absolute truth. You know, those principles pull from there. So what can we gain? You see this in Matthew. You see this earlier, just twice in Genesis, where there's large sections of just information, genealogies, history. So what is the premise? One of the things that you remember, especially about the Old Testament, but the whole book, it is a book of history. You have to remember, a lot of people look at the Old Testament specifically, but all of the Bible, and they tell you that some of the accounts that we read, some of the accounts that are taking place are not factual. They'll tell you that they're great allegorical stories, great fictional stories that never actually took place. You go to stories like the flood, go to stories like Jonah and the whale. You go to stories like David and Goliath. Well, they're great, good principled stories. They really didn't happen. And that's one of the great battles when studying Scripture, is that if you go with that perception, what happens is these are neat stories, but they lose a little of the legitimacy when you think they're not real. What do you mean by that? What I mean by that is when I see a story that many want to say is a made-up fictional story from a section of the Old Testament, how is that any different than a bedtime story? How is it any different than a fairy tale put together? And with that thinking, there is no difference. Okay, you've got the morals of this fairy tale, the morals of the Bible, and what it does is it relegates to a Bible to just another part of classical literature. Okay, you can't prove it's true. It's not, but it's great literature. We can pull some principles from it. The struggle with that is the Bible clearly states that this is more than just literature. This is God's love letter to us, God's instruction book to us, and we learn about God, we learn about the truths, we learn about God's people from the Bible when we realize that what we're reading are not made up stories. These are factual events. These things took place. So one of the ways that we can know that these things took place is like in the first few verses. If you want, you can take the information, you can go do some study in history, and you can find that these stories took place, and you can find the time they took place by studying and looking up history. An example of this, in our church not long ago, we did a series through the book of Esther. The intriguing thing about the book of Esther is you see what they call Artaxerxes, or we call Xerxes in history. You can go back to history and you can find Xerxes and you can see true history. And what you do is you begin to see how that history flows in with Scripture. And the reason for this is when you can tie these truths with history, you're reminded that this is more than just a classical piece of literature. This is truth. And then it puts validity behind. You don't need to, but it's another step to put validity behind what's happening. So one of the reasons for this is you can look into history and you can see that these things are real. This happened. So then what we look at for the next couple of minutes, and we see what God does in freeing Lot and using Abram, brings even more great power and faithfulness, because we know that these cases are true and it's not just like a Marvel story we see on the movies. So let me go on. The next thing is say that what we see here at the end of the verses we read is that when these kings took the spoils of the land, they took Lot and his family and their spoils with them. And a lot of times that would happen. They would take prisoners of war and they'd take them with them. And it happened to be that Abram's nephew was taken with. If Abram if Lot had not been there, this wouldn't have happened. Now, I'm not saying that God brought judgment in the land with war to make Lot be taken. I'm just saying that when you make decisions, there are sometimes unintended consequences as a result. And this is one of those unintended consequences where because of Lot's decision, he finds himself in this really uncomfortable scenario. Let's continue to read and find out what happens after that. Then we go to verse 13. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram, the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, the brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Now Abram heard that his brother was taken captive. He armed his, catch this, 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided his forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Habo, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shavah, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Now what you see here is an ally who knew, or an ally of Abram who heard this happen, went and told Abram. Abram takes, let me get the exact number, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, 318 trained men. Now please understand, they're going to take on a huge army. So you're taking 318 men. It clarifies that they were trained. Well, that would make sense because you would need trained men to do what they're about to do. But even then, these armies won against another army size about as large as them. So 318 men by themselves really weren't going to be able to do this. Now, we know in history, with the right training, that group of men could do a large amount of work. They could do some damage. They could do some great work in the military force. But I also see here that Abram goes, and remember God had promised Abram already at this point that whoever blesses you will be blessed, whoever doesn't. Like there was this understanding, and I believe what you see here is you see God going before fulfilling his covenant, saying, you know what, you're going to go, we're going to go with you. And because Abram went, Lot was delivered. As a result, another step of God's faithfulness. And again, you can see another situation where you've got Lot who shouldn't have even been there. He shouldn't have been in Sodom and Gomorrah. He shouldn't have been down there. He shouldn't have been in the spot where he was in a spot where he knew, and every part of him knew he shouldn't have been there, but he chose to do it. And now he finds himself in an unintended consequence, and yet God still worked. And this one wasn't worked because Lot was doing right, worked because Abram had done right. And we see this. And again, we'll look a little bit more, and we go back and forth a little bit on Lot and Abram in the next few episodes and next few sections of Scripture. But as we look at this, you do get to see the faithfulness of God. You get to see that when Abram stepped out, God went with him, God protected, God blessed. Now, if you were to study out some of what happened here, I read a bunch of it this morning, You're going to find there were some great tactics that had taken place where Abram had used wisdom and was smart in military. He trained his people knowing this was to happen. He was surrounded by people who disagreed. And when you become wealthy, people want what you have. So he had prepared for what was happening. And you can even talk a bit about that idea, that the preparation that Abram took to be there to train his people for war. But in this scenario, you begin to see, one, Lot should have never been there, but yet God's faithfulness to Abram and how Lot was freed as a result of Abram. And that's one of the things we can look at. We can always see God's faithfulness. And we've said this before, but we'll say it again. We see the result of God's faithfulness even sometimes when we don't deserve it. And honestly, that's the greatest part of God's grace. God's grace is God giving us something we don't deserve. His faithfulness, His mercy, His love, His forgiveness, we don't deserve it. We actually deserve His wrath. And in that, we see His faithfulness when we don't deserve it. And it's one of the greatest principles we can hold on to, is God's love, God's faithfulness, and God's mercy when we deserve the opposite. I hope that's an encouragement to you today, wherever you find yourself, that His faithfulness is new every day. And no matter where you are, you can come to Him and you can trust in His faithfulness in your life. Again, we thank you for the wonderful privilege you've given to us to be part of your day. We hope it's a help. Stick with us as we continue to look into the book of Genesis and continue to learn in this situation from the stories of Abram and Lot. Again, thanks for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again next time.